Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of Above the 49th. I'm Mark Adam, your head dummy, and thank you so much for joining us. Happy New Year! We are back, and honestly, we've got a lot to cover because while Canadians were busy arguing whether minus 30 is cold or just Tuesday, the world decided to lose its entire mind. But first, let's talk about some headlines you might have missed because not everything in Canada this week has been political chaos. Some of it was just regular chaos. A viral TikTok video this week showed a couple absolutely crammed into a WestJet flight leaving Edmonton, sparking a national debate about airline legroom. And look, 6'4", I've seen the video. These people had less personal space than a Canada Goose has patience. They were compressed into a configuration that I'm pretty sure violates the Geneva Convention. WestJet has apparently perfected a new form of travel where your knees arrive in Toronto a full 10 minutes before the rest of your body. It's not flying, it's compression therapy you didn't ask for. One passenger advocate actually applauded the video as evidence for better regulations, which is the most Canadian thing ever. Thank you for documenting your suffering so politely that we can use it in a committee hearing. In other news, a Canadian car thief made headlines for stealing the wrong vehicle, realizing his mistake, and then returning it with a full tank of gas and an apology note. This is the most aggressively Canadian crime I have ever heard of. In the States, your catalytic converter gets stolen. In Canada, the thief details your car, tops up the fluid, and leaves a Tim Hortons gift card with a note that says, "My bad, bud." I'm not saying we should encourage car theft, but if you're gonna do crime, that's how you do crime. It's like breaking and entering, but you also meal prep for the week. And finally, a goat in Saskatchewan refused to leave a Tim Hortons and was eventually removed by authorities, which raises so many questions. First, how did the goat get in? Second, what was he ordering? And third, did it at least win roll up the rim before getting arrested? Only in Canada do we arrest livestock for loitering instead of just giving them a double-double and letting them vibe. That goat was probably just trying to escape the cold, which, honestly, fair. It's January in Saskatchewan. I'd break into a Tim Hortons too. Alright, before we get into our main story, we need to talk about what's happening in Canada's official opposition, because the Conservative Party is about to do something very Canadian and hold a leadership review to decide whether they should fire the guy who just won them more seats. So here's the situation. In the 2025 election, Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives gained seats and won 42% of the popular vote. That's a solid performance, but they didn't win government. Mark Carney's Liberals formed a minority with help from some Conservative defectors, which is a whole other mess we've covered before. And now, the Conservative Party membership is gathering in Calgary for a leadership review to decide if Poilievre should stay on as leader, which on the surface seems insane. Hey, you grew the party and won more votes than anyone. Let's vote on whether to fire you. It's like firing the chef because the restaurant got too busy. But here's the thing. The Conservatives didn't just not win. They blew a massive lead. At one point during the campaign, Poilievre was up nearly 20 points in the polls. He had momentum, enthusiasm, and the Liberals were in chaos with Trudeau stepping down mid-campaign. All he had to do was not screw it up. And then he kind of screwed it up. The Conservatives ran a campaign that focused heavily on axe the tax, referring to the carbon tax, but struggled to articulate a broader vision. When pressed on policy details, Poilievre often pivoted back to slogans. And in the final weeks, enough voters got nervous about what a Conservative government would actually do that they swung back to the Liberals or voted strategically to block a Poilievre majority. And then there's the other problem. Poilievre lost his own seat. He'd represented a riding in the Ottawa area for years, but in 2025, he lost it, which meant that immediately after election night, he had to scramble to find a Conservative seat in Alberta somewhere where someone would step aside and let him run in a by-election, which he did. He's now the MP for an Alberta riding. But it's not exactly a great look when the leader of the opposition has to flee to Alberta because his own community said, actually, no thanks. So now Conservative members are split. Some are saying he grew the party, he increased our vote share, he's doing fine. Others are saying he had a 20-point lead and lost to a guy who'd been prime minister for 3 weeks, and before that, a politician for none. And look, both sides have a point. On paper, the Conservatives are in a better shape than they were when they started. But on the other hand, if you can't win when the Liberals are in total disarray and you're up by 20 points, when can you win? The leadership review is happening in Calgary, which is very fitting because Calgary is where Conservative leaders go to either get coronated or executed, and no one knows which until the votes are counted. Poilievre needs 50% support to stay on as leader. If he gets it, he's safe, and the party moves forward. If he doesn't, the Conservatives will be looking for their next leader, which means another leadership race, more internal drama, and probably another year of Liberals looking way more stable than they have any right to. Now here's what's wild. Even if Poilievre survives this review, he's damaged. Because now everyone knows that a significant chunk of his own party thinks he blew it. And that's not great going into the next election, whatever happens. But if he doesn't survive, the Conservatives have to start over. New leader, new message, new strategy. And that takes time, which means the Liberals will get even more runway to consolidate power. So basically, no matter what happens in Calgary, the Conservatives are kind of screwed. Either they're stuck with a leader half the party doesn't trust, or they're starting from scratch while the Liberals govern. It's like watching someone choose between a root canal and a colonoscopy. Technically, depending on the context, one of them is the better option, but neither one sounds fun. We'll know the results soon. But either way, the Conservative Party is about to have a very interesting few months. Now you might be thinking, okay, but at least the Conservatives have seats and a functioning party structure. Well, let me introduce you to the NDP. All right. So, while the Conservatives are arguing about whether their leader is good enough, the NDP is trying to figure out if they even qualify as a political party anymore. Because in the 2025 election, the New Democratic Party was reduced to 7 seats. 7. In the entire House of Commons. That's not a caucus, that's a group chat. To put that in perspective, the NDP went from being the 3rd largest party in Parliament to having fewer MPs than some provinces have Costco locations. They got crushed. And look, it's not hard to understand why. The NDP spent years propping up the Liberal government through a confidence and supply agreement, which meant they voted with the Liberals on key legislation in exchange for, well, not very much, as it turns out. Voters who wanted progressive change got frustrated because the NDP couldn't deliver on big promises, and voters who were mad at the Liberals blamed the NDP for keeping them in power. So the NDP got hit from both sides. It's like being the friend who agrees to split the bill at a restaurant, and then everyone orders lobster, and you're sitting there with a side salad going, wait, how is this fair? Now, the NDP is in full crisis mode. Jagmeet Singh stepped down after the election, which, honestly, yeah, that makes sense. And the party is now holding a leadership race to figure out who's going to rebuild the party from the ashes. And here's where it gets even more painful. The candidates running to lead the NDP are not exactly household names. I'm not going to mock any of these people individually. They're putting themselves forward to lead a party in crisis, which takes guts. But here's the problem. None of them are bilingual. Not one. In a country where one of the 2 official languages is French, and Quebec is a province with 78 seats in Parliament, the NDP is running a leadership race where none of the candidates can fluently speak English and French. That's not a minor issue. That's a how do you plan to win in Quebec issue. And if you can't compete in Quebec, you can't form government. You probably can't even form official opposition. You're capped at, 3rd place at best. It's like applying to be a pilot, but mentioning in the interview that you're not super comfortable with heights. Technically, you could still do the job, but why would anybody hire you? Now, to be fair, one of the candidates is reportedly taking French lessons, which is great. Learning a language is hard, and I respect the effort. But also, maybe do that before you run to lead a national political party. The NDP's internal post-election review called 2025 a brutal environment, which is the kind of understatement you'd expect from a party that just lost 90% of its seats. It's like the Titanic's captain saying the iceberg was suboptimal for hull integrity. So now the NDP is in this weird position where they're technically still a party, but they've lost official party status in some provinces, they have no money, no momentum, and a leadership race that feels more like a support group than a campaign. And here's the kicker. Even if they pick a great leader and somehow rebuild, they're starting from just 7 seats. That's not a comeback story, that's a fucking miracle. They'd have to quintuple their seat count just to get back to being irrelevant. Now, I'm not saying the NDP is dead. Political parties have come back from worse. But right now, the NDP is less of a political force and more of a vibe. They're Canada's indie band, critically respected by a small group of fans, commercially ignored by everyone else, and constantly changing lead singers. And the sad part is, there are people who want what the NDP is selling. Stronger social programs, climate action, workers' rights. But the party has been so thoroughly destroyed that even people who agree with them don't think that they can win. So they vote Liberal strategically. It's a brutal cycle. And unless the NDP can figure out how to break it, they're going to spend the next decade as Parliament's seventh most important voice. So to sum up, the Conservatives are fighting over whether to keep the guy who lost the winnable election, and the NDP is trying to find anyone who can speak French and is willing to captain a sinking ship. Canadian politics, everybody! We make Game of Thrones look functional. Okay, that's the fun stuff, but our main story tonight is decidedly not fun, because this week, while we were all distracted by airline legroom and criminal goats, the United States launched a full-scale military operation in Venezuela, captured the president, and might have just accidentally broken the global oil market. In Canada, we're right in the middle of it, holding a bunch of oil we suddenly can't sell to anyone, watching the US dollar maybe start to collapse, and Mark Carney is somewhere reading an economic briefing like this was not the job description. So tonight, we need to talk about Venezuela, oil, and how Canada just became the world's most anxious bystander in what might be the dumbest geopolitical crisis of the decade. All right, let's start with what actually happened, because if you only caught headlines this week, you might be confused. On January 3rd, the United States launched a military operation in Venezuela called Operation Absolute Resolve, which is the kind of name you come up with when Operation We're Doing This Whether You Like It or Not tested poorly with focus groups. The operation involved airstrikes in Caracas, special forces on the ground, and the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, who were transferred to a U.S. warship offshore. The official justification: drug trafficking, terrorism, and restoring democracy. Now, if you're thinking, wait, can the U.S. just do that? Yes, apparently they can, and they did. It's like showing up to someone's house, kicking in the door and saying, we're redecorating, you're coming with us, and this is for your own good. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because it isn't just about Venezuela. It's about oil, specifically about heavy crude oil. And if you're thinking, I don't know what that means, don't worry, we're going to break it down. Okay, quick lesson. Not all oil is the same. There are two main types. There's light, sweet crude, which is easy to refine, low in sulfur, and sounds like a Starbucks order. And then there's heavy, sour crude, which is thick, sulfuric, difficult to process, and sounds like something you'd find in a villain's lair. Think of it like this. Light crude is skim milk. Heavy crude is molasses mixed with rotten eggs. Both are liquids, but you wouldn't want to put one of them in your coffee. Now here's the problem. The United States produces tons of oil. They're one of the biggest producers in the world. But most of what they produce is light sweet crude because that's what comes out of shale deposits in places like Texas and North Dakota. Great, right? Lots of oil, energy independence, everything's fine. Except, and this is a big except, many of the refineries on the US Gulf Coast were built decades ago specifically to process heavy crude, the kind that comes from places like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Mexico. So now, the US has a bunch of refineries designed to handle oil they don't produce, and a bunch of oil that doesn't fit the refineries they have. It's like buying a house full of DVD players right before everything switched to streaming. Technically, they still work, but for what? And Venezuela? Venezuela has some of the largest crude oil reserves on the planet, sitting in something called the Orinoco Belt. We're talking billions of barrels. It's a staggering amount of oil, the kind of oil that the US refineries were literally built to process. So when the US talks about securing stability in Venezuela, what they might actually mean is, we would very much like access to that oil, please and thank you. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what does that have to do with Canada? Oh, buddy, everything. Because Canada is sitting on the second largest oil reserves in the world, most of it in the Alberta oil sands, and guess what kind of oil we produce? That's right, heavy crude, the exact same kind that Venezuela has. We've been selling it to the US for years, and now suddenly the US is looking at Venezuela like, actually, we might have other options. But before we get to Canada's problem, we need to talk about the bigger issue here, because this isn't just about oil, it's about money. Specifically, it's about the US dollar and a system that's been holding the global economy together for 50 years. And that system? It might be breaking. All right, we need to talk about something called the petrodollar. And if you've never heard of it, that's okay, because it's one of those things that's incredibly important, but also incredibly boring, which is why no one talks about it until it explodes. Here's the simplest explanation. In the 1970s, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The deal was this. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars, and in exchange, the US would provide military protection, buy tons of Saudi oil, and help keep Saudi royal family in power. Now, why does that matter? because oil is the most traded commodity on the planet. Every country needs it. Cars, planes, factories, heating, everything runs on oil. So if oil can only be bought in US dollars, that means every country in the world needs to have US dollars in order to buy oil. It's like if I owned the only grocery store in town, but I only accepted Canadian Tire money. Suddenly, everyone needs Canadian Tire money, and a lot of it. And that makes Canadian Tire money the most valuable currency in town because you literally can't eat without it. That's what the petrodollar did for the US. It made the US dollar the most important currency on earth because if you wanted oil, you needed dollars. And that gave the US enormous power. But here's the thing, that 50-year deal, it expired in June of 2024, and Saudi Arabia chose not to renew it, which means that for the first time in half a century, Saudi Arabia is free to sell oil in whatever currency they want. Won, euros, rubles, a basket of currencies from BRICS nations, anything. And they're not the only ones. More and more countries are moving away from the dollar for energy trades, especially within BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Plus, a bunch of other nations that are tired of the US having a monopoly on global reserve currency. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but what does that have to do with Venezuela? Okay, great question. Because there were rumors, and I want to be clear, these are rumors, not confirmed, that Venezuela was about to sign a deal to sell oil exclusively in a basket of BRICS currencies. And if that's true, and again, we don't have proof, it would mean one of the largest oil producers in the Western Hemisphere was about to stop using US dollars entirely. And from a perspective of the US, that's a problem, and a big one. Because here's the thing about the dollar. The only reason the US can print trillions of dollars, run massive deficits, and not collapse into hyperinflation is because everyone needs dollars. It's called exorbitant privilege. The dollar is the global reserve currency, so the US can essentially export its inflation to the rest of the world. But if countries stop needing dollars for oil, if they can buy energy in yuan or rubles or some new BRICS currency, then all those dollars the US has been printing for decades suddenly comes flooding back to the US and the value of the dollar starts to drop. That's when some analysts are calling the death of the petrodollar. And if that happens, it doesn't just hurt the US, it destabilizes the entire global economy. So when the US launched a military operation to remove Maduro and potentially take control of Venezuela's oil reserves, some people started asking, is this about democracy and drug trafficking? Or is this about making sure Venezuelan oil keeps flowing in US dollars? I don't know. And frankly, neither does anyone else because the US isn't exactly publishing internal memos titled, Why We Actually Invaded Venezuela, the real reasons. But the timing is, let's say, interesting. Okay, so now let's talk about Canada because we are screwed. Canada produces about 4.8 million barrels of oil per day, most of it from the Alberta oil sands. And as we discussed, it's heavy crude, the same type Venezuela produces. For years, we've been selling it almost exclusively to the United States because they're right next door. They have the refineries that can process it, and shipping across an ocean is expensive and complicated. Our entire energy export economy is built on the assumption that the US will keep buying our oil. It's like if you ran a restaurant and 95% of your customers were one guy named Steve. You'd probably want to make sure that Steve keeps coming back. But now, Steve just invaded Venezuela and he might be about to secure a massive new supply of the exact product you're selling, which means Steve might not need you anymore. And it gets worse because it's not just about competition with Venezuela, it's about something called the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. The SPR is basically the US government's emergency oil stockpile. Think of it like a massive underground gas tank that the government keeps for emergencies, natural disasters, wars, supply shocks, that kind of thing. At its peak in 2009, it held about 727 million barrels of oil. But between 2022 and 2023, the US drained a huge amount of it. Why? To lower gas prices during a period of high inflation and political pressure. They sold off about 180 million barrels, the largest release in the SPR's history, to keep gas prices from spiking right before an election year. Now, some people called this smart politics. Others called it selling the family silver to pay the rent. Either way, it worked. Gas prices stabilized and the administration avoided an economic crisis. But here's the problem. Now, the SPR is low. Really low. As of late 2023, it hit the lowest level since the 1980s, around 350 million barrels. Since then, they've been slowly refilling it, and as of this week, 2026, it's back up to about 413 million barrels. So it's not empty, but it's still well below where it used to be. And refilling it requires buying oil, which means the US government is now in the market competing with everyone else for barrels. Here's where Canada enters the picture, because when the US was looking to refill the SPR, they needed heavy crude, the kind that their Gulf Coast refineries are designed for. They looked at their options, right? Option 1, buy from Canada. We're right next door. We have pipelines. It's easy. Option 2, buy from Saudi Arabia, but Saudi production has been inconsistent. They're cutting output to keep prices high, and they're cozying up to China. And option 3, buy from Venezuela. But Venezuela is under sanctions, Maduro is hostile to the US, and oh yeah, they're maybe about to start selling oil in BRICS currencies. So what did the US do? They invaded Venezuela. Now look, I'm not saying the only reason for the invasion was oil. There are some legitimate concerns about drug trafficking, human rights abuses, and regional instability. But when you're running low on a specific type of oil, your main supplier is flirting with your geopolitical rivals, and a country with massive reserves of exactly what you need is sitting right there, well, the math starts to look pretty straightforward. And for Canada, this is a nightmare, because if the US secures Venezuelan oil, they have less reason to buy ours. And we don't exactly have a lot of other options. We can't easily ship to Asia. It's expensive. We don't have enough Pacific Coast infrastructure, and pipeline projects keep getting blocked. We can't ship to Europe. Too far, too costly. Our entire energy economy is built around one customer, and that customer just found a new supplier. Or in what Troy and Abed would call the darkest timeline, the US will keep Venezuela and become their own supplier. It's like showing up to your shift at work, finding out your boss hired your replacement but didn't fire you, but also keeps talking about operational efficiencies and looking at you weird. You're not fired yet, but you're definitely updating your resume. Okay, so if you're watching this and thinking, well, Canada should just sell oil to someone else, I admire your optimism, but it's not quite that simple. First, infrastructure. To sell oil overseas, you need ports, pipelines, and export terminals. Canada has been trying to build more of those for years, but every major pipeline project gets tied up in regulatory reviews, environmental assessments, and political battles. And look, I'm not here to litigate pipeline politics. Reasonable people disagree about climate, indigenous rights, and energy policy, but the result is that Canada doesn't have the infrastructure to easily pivot away from the US market. Second, price. Shipping oil across the ocean is expensive, like really expensive. Canadian heavy crude already sells at a discount compared to lighter crudes because it's harder to refine. Add in the cost of shipping it to Asia or Europe, and suddenly it's not competitive anymore. It's like trying to sell snow cones in Alaska. Technically you could, but why would anybody buy them when they're surrounded by free snow? And third, refinery capability. Remember how we talked about refineries being designed for specific types of crude? Most Asian refineries are optimized for Middle Eastern oil, which is lighter than Canadian crude. They can process ours, but they'd rather not because it's more work and more expensive. So even if we could ship our oil across the Pacific tomorrow, we'd still be trying to sell a product that's harder to move, costs more to transport, and isn't what most buyers want. That's not a great business model. And here's the kicker. Even if we did somehow solve all of that, there's still the currency problem. Because remember the whole petrodollar thing? If more and more countries start trading oil in yuan or rubles or BRICS currencies, and the US dollar starts to lose value, that affects everyone, including Canada. Our dollar is heavily tied to the US economy. If the US dollar crashes, ours goes with it. Our trade is overwhelmingly with the US. Our financial systems are intertwined. We're not just neighbors, we're economically joined at the hip. So even if Canada wanted to pivot away from the US and start selling oil in yuan to China, we'd be betting against our own largest trading partner and risking the stability of our own currency. It's like trying to burn down your neighbor's house while living in a duplex. Technically possible, but extremely inadvisable. Now, you might be thinking, okay, what about Mark Carney? He's the Prime Minister, he used to run the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. Surely he has a plan, right? And the answer is, maybe? But here's the thing. Carney is extremely smart. He understands global finance better than almost anyone, but he also inherited an energy economy that's been built over decades to serve one customer at a moment when that customer is potentially about to ghost us. There is no quick fix for this. You can't just snap your fingers and build new pipelines. You can't magically make Canadian heavy crude cheaper to ship, and you can't restructure the entire Canadian economy away from the US without causing massive economic pain. So what Carney is probably doing right now is reading a briefing note that says something like, maintain relationship with the US, explore alternative markets, monitor global currency shifts, and hope it all blows over before it gets worse, which is not exactly inspiring, but it's also the only realistic option. Okay. So just to recap, the US invaded Venezuela, potentially to secure oil. Saudi Arabia ended the petrodollar deal. BRICS nations are trading energy in non-dollar currencies. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve is still below historic levels. And Canada is sitting on a massive pile of oil we might not be able to sell. Got it? Great. Because here's the part that makes it even more bananas, if you can imagine. Some analysts are now saying that this whole thing, the Venezuela operation, the scramble for heavy crude, the dollar instability, might actually backfire on the US. Here's why. If the world sees the US invading countries to secure oil, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the stability of the dollar or the US-led global order. It actually might accelerate the move away from the dollar because countries start thinking, if the US is willing to do that for oil, maybe we should start having a backup plan. It's like if your bank started robbing other banks to stay solvent. Technically, they're getting more money, but you're probably moving your savings account. So the US might have just made the exact problem they were trying to solve worse. And if that happens, if more countries abandon the dollar faster because of this, then the US will be in an even weaker position and the entire global economy, including Canada's, will be even more unstable. And that's where we are right now, watching the US potentially destabilize the very system that kept the global economy running for 50 years in an attempt to save that system. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Sure, it's a liquid, but maybe we should think this through. In Canada, we're just standing here holding a bunch of heavy crude oil, watching the house burn, and politely asking if anybody needs a fire extinguisher. So what do we do? Look, here's the reality. Canada is in a really difficult position, and there are no easy answers. We have oil, lots of it, but we have spent decades building an economy that depends almost entirely on selling that oil to one country. And now that country might not need us as much anymore, or the currency we trade in might lose value, or the entire global oil market might be restructuring in ways we can't control. And the worst part? None of this is really Canada's fault. We didn't end the petrodollar deal. We didn't invade Venezuela. We didn't drain the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We just exist in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong kind of oil. So what can Canada do? Short term, not much. We keep selling to the US as long as they'll buy. We try to build better relationships with other markets. We invest in infrastructure that gives us more options, and we cross our fingers that the global economy doesn't collapse. Long term, we probably need to rethink our entire energy strategy, because even if this crisis passes, the world is moving towards renewable energy, electric vehicles, and reduced oil dependence. And if we're still betting everything on oil in 20 years from now, we're going to be in a worse shape. But that's a conversation for another episode, because right now we're stuck managing the crisis we have, not the transition we should be planning. So to sum up, again, the US invaded Venezuela, possibly for oil. The petrodollar system that's held the global economy together for 50 years is maybe ending. And Canada is caught in the middle with a product we can't easily sell to anyone else in a currency that might be losing value, while our government tries to figure out how to navigate all of this without tanking the economy. And that's why, when someone asks, why should I care about some military operation in a country I've never been to? The answer is because it might be the thing that determines whether you have a job next year, whether gas prices explode, or whether the Canadian dollar is worth anything. Oh, and also, a goat got arrested at Tim Hortons, so it hasn't been all bad. That's our show. Thanks for watching Above the 49th this week. Happy 2026. Stay warm, stay informed, and for the love of God, someone check on Mark Carney. He looks like he needs a hug. See you next time, dummies.